This evening for our religious reflection, we have my friend, Rabbi Mark Gruber. His email handle is Veggie Rabbi, having been a vegetarian since 1972. He has served Reform congregations on the East Coast and in the Midwest, in addition to having been the national co-chair of the New Jewish Agenda, which was a multi-issue progressive Jewish political organization, and the co-chair of Reform Jewish Voice of New York State. He helped found the Anti-Racism Project and has spoken and written on issues of economic justice, social equality, nonviolence, the Middle East, and the concerns of people with disabilities. Rabbi Gruber is particularly proud that the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism selected him to be one of their 50 at 50 in honor of the RAC's anniversary social justice leaders. Here in D.C., where he now lives, Rabbi Gruber serves on the Green Team of Temple Sinai. Responding to Hurricane Sandy while at Central Synagogue in Nassau County, he experienced firsthand the impact of climate change, and we're delighted that he's here this evening to offer us his religious reflection.
Thank you, Melanie. As I said, it would have been enough to say I love studying and learning Torah and hiking, because I'm going to speak about those two things briefly this evening. Currently, we're in the 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot, known as the Omer period. And Omer is a sheaf of grain, and it was an ancient measure, and it refers, in this case, to the barley offering that was brought to the temple on the second day of Passover. Starting on that day, the Torah instructs us in Leviticus 23, you shall count from the eve of the second day of Pesach, when an omer of grain is to be brought as an offering, 7 complete weeks. The day after the 7th week of your counting will make 50 days, and you shall present a new meal offering to God. And of course, we observe the festival of Shavuot on the 50th day. The counting of the Omer, Sfirat HaOmer, which lasts for 49 days, takes place at night. It commences on the second night of Pesach, and those who count the Omer recite a blessing each night of the 50-day period and then mark the day. And the count is stated in both total days. Today is the 22nd day of the Omer, and in weeks and days, which is 3 weeks and 1 day of the Omer. That would actually be tomorrow, but I couldn't illustrate it with today, which is only 3 weeks. The Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar with a solar correction. And the process includes adding 7 months during a 19-year cycle. If you're confused about that, multiply 7 times 210, by 7 by 30, and you get 210, and then multiply 11, because the lunar year is 11 days shorter than the solar year, by 19, and you get 209. It's remarkable that this was figured out in antiquity, when to add the month, and it's always the first month of Adar as the winter thaws into the spring. And it included an assessment of human needs and the provisions of the earth, to intercalate or add an extra month because people needed to eat the old grain before the new barley and winter wheat have sprouted. So our sages attended to the rhythms of creation and the current realities of the growing cycle and its relationship to sustaining human beings. We are earthlings of and living with the earth. Here in the Hebrew, we are Adam, and we live on and with Adamah. Adam, human being, Adamah, the earth. So why count? Why bother with this? We don't collect sheaves of barley. There's no temple in which we can deliver the sheaves. The sheaves we don't have anyway. So some reasons include, first, it's simply commanded in the Torah. It seems like a fairly easy way to collect some mitzvah points. All you have to do is count each evening for 7 weeks. Two, by preserving the count of the Omer, even without the temple, the rabbis are reminding us that Passover is not truly complete until we commemorate the giving of the Torah at Sinai on Shavuot. So freedom without responsibility is incomplete and unreal. And by counting, we remind ourselves the process is not yet finished. Three, we observe the Omer because it fosters self-improvement. In preparation to receive the Torah on Shavuot, we work to become better Jews. We read and study Pirkei Avot during this season. The first chapters of the Mishnah consist mostly of expectations the rabbis express for their own proper behavior and attitude. It's appropriate material for reflection and personal growth. And I think really most significantly, we deliberately count up to Shavuot because it creates awareness and reflection. So I thought about when else do I really have times for reflection like this? And for me, hiking is a time for reflection. I glean lessons from hiking as I go through the stages of life. And the lessons are sometimes actually a result of adapting my changing abilities to the trail ahead of me. I continue to hike because I make necessary changes. Infirmities, disabilities, changed abilities all need to be considered. To safely enjoy challenging hikes, I recognize new normals and adjust my behavior. We have aged our earth and our planet is vulnerable and hurting. Climate change is a cry to us as we move through the Omer from Pesach's freedom, liberty is not license, to responsibility, to renewed Shavuot stewardship. When we think about these changes that are destroying our home, we feel a sense of dread. The antidote for our fear of planetary changes is to slow down, think, reflect, consider choices and consequence over a longer term, and consider each day as well. Renee, my wife, and I walk about 4 to 5 miles a day. Our routes take us through neighborhoods and woods. Especially at this season, Renee takes great delight in flower gardens. And I'm recharged when I'm surrounded by woods. When I need a quick fix, I have a 50-minute walk, mostly in the trees, on trodden dirt paths. That's my rejuvenation route. I know this hike well. I can zip around quickly. I like a quick pace, but I remember to slow down to enjoy the trees and the flowers, the critters and the skies. When I hike on rough trails with great views, especially when they're unfamiliar, I am deliberately slower. I count and consider my steps. My depth perception is compromised. So I focus on the trail. And depending on the terrain, I count a set number of paces and then I stop and I take in the view. I pause and appreciate the hike and the creation, and then I resume with my paces. And then I stop again. And that way I can enjoy both the hike, the reflection, and do it safely. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav wrote a meditation that resonates for me. You may have heard it. The translation into English is not by Anonymous, as it's often listed. It's by my late friend, Rabbi Shammai Cantor. Master of the universe, grant me the ability to be alone. May it be my custom to go outdoors each day among the trees and grasses, among all growing things, and there may I be alone and enter into prayer to talk with the one to whom I belong. May I express everything in my heart, and may all the foliage of the field, all grasses and trees and plants awake at my coming to send the powers of their life into the words of my prayer, so my prayer and speech are made whole through the life and spirit of all growing things, which are made as one by their transcendent source. May I then pour out the words of my heart before your presence like water. Eternal One, lift up my hands to you in worship on my behalf and that of my children. My thoughts while I hike remind me of the time we make for reflection now. As my abilities to hike have changed, I recognize I'm aging and not as agile as I was just a decade ago. I'm reminded that our Earth is not so agile these days. We're stressing the planet in ways we understand and ways we do not fully grasp. We need to slow down and consider our actions and what we can do to improve the environment for the next generations. We need to be more deliberate and less arrogant. As we count this week of weeks to the celebration of our people's epiphany at Mount Sinai, we recognize that our stewardship of the earth is an essential and awesome responsibility for the well being of all. So let us count together. We start with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sfirat ha'omer. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with mitzvot, who commands us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is the 21st day, totaling 3 weeks of the Omer. We're joined together this evening at a program of the Jewish Earth Alliance. May our counting help us to know the message of our Torah. Everyone counts, and our community will be strongest and our efforts most successful when we can count on everyone.
Thank you so much, Mark, for enlivening the Sphera, the counting, for reminding us of its ties with responsibility, an important theme for us as advocates, bringing back to us a prayer that some of us may know from Debbie Friedman's music, bringing us warm feelings, and reminding us to make our days count by the actions that we take. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. In a moment, we're going to turn to our main topic this evening, which is permitting reform. It's a little different from some of the topics we've addressed because it's very complicated and has lots of intricacies. So we are particularly thankful to have a well-informed speaker. I'm going to turn to Debbie, who's a member of our steering committee, and she's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm very happy tonight to introduce Erik Schlenker-Goodrich. Erik joined the Western Environmental Law Center as a staff attorney in 2003 and became its executive director in 2012. Erik has fought in court to safeguard our climate from dirty fossil fuels, promote our transition to a clean energy future, and protect the American West's rivers and wildlands. An expert in issues related to oil and gas development, Erik leads the Western Environmental Law Center's campaigns to phase out fossil fuels and to build climate resilience. Before joining the Western Environmental Law Center, or WELC, he worked as a public lands attorney for the Wilderness Society. Erik is a graduate of Cornell University with a Bachelor of Science degree in Natural Resources, and he earned his law degree and a certificate in Environmental Law and Natural Resources from the University of Oregon Law School. Erik has been down in the trenches on this permitting reform, assessing and communicating the problems posed by the SPEED Act, a proposed law that, under the guise of speeding up the permitting process for large energy infrastructure development, would actually surrender too much to fossil fuels. It's not the bill we need, and we can do better. Erik will explain further. Thanks, Erik.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you, Mark, for the opening. Reminded me very much of Mary Oliver, who I suspect many of you know, a poet and writer, lived on Cape Cod, has been very influential in my life. In her book, Upstream, she writes, attention is the beginning of devotion. And that's very much what came to mind when I was listening to you, Mark, and your meditations on hiking in nature and slowing down and paying attention to what is around us. And that's, I think, also a really good guide to us as we think about the fraught topic of permitting reform. This is a very complicated subject because it involves all US energy and other infrastructure, and thus, by definition, also our economy and our politics. And the dynamic with permitting reform is incredibly complex. And I'll get into how we're approaching this at the Western Environmental Law Center. But I'll start with a little bit of background. The permitting reform fight really sparked up in the wake of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. And the reason that the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, if folks recollect, is because Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia ultimately decided that he would support the bill. He did so, though, on the basis of a concession made to him. And that concession was for Congress to take up the issue of permitting reform. And that's when I started to get very seriously involved in this particular dynamic. We hadn't really engaged in federal legislation all that much. We had relied on groups that are based in DC, have significant government affairs and lobby shops. But after the IRA was passed in 2022 and Manchin released a draft of a permitting reform bill that very notably had the watermark of the American Petroleum Institute on it, we became very alarmed. And the concepts in there were designed to erode bedrock environmental protections and community safeguards that we had relied on for decades, for nearly 50 years, to protect public lands, wildlife, and waters and communities in the Western United States. And just to step back on that, my organization, Western Environmental Law Center, we're a public interest environmental law firm. In any given year, we represent roughly 175 to 200 environmental, climate, environmental justice, and community-based organizations. We have a fairly straightforward mission, which is to use the power of the law to safeguard the public lands, wildlife, and waters and communities of the West in the face of a changing climate. And if you boil that down to its essence and the way that we've changed our own approach to the law and to advocacy, it's predicated on this notion of an ecology of kinship. The relationship that we have as human beings with ourselves, with the people around us, our friends and family, but also people we are meeting for the first time, and then our relationship with the world around us and the other life, and the idea that we need to live in kinship with ourselves, with each other, and with the world around us. We have a philosopher on our board who's very much helped to shape that particular mission of the organization, an ecology of kinship. So back to permitting reform, and it's how we approach that. We approach that through the lens of an ecology of kinship. We were able to defeat, for the most part, all iterations of permitting reform during the Biden years. We had the backstop, of course, of the presidency to be able to veto a particular bill. Some legislation was able to slip through. There was, for example, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which approved one of Joe Manchin's pet projects, the Mountain View Pipeline in West Virginia, which I think speaks volumes about what his intent was with permitting reform. In other words, to accelerate fossil fuels development. He was a coal baron, of course. He was very much a backer of the natural gas boom in the Marcellus Shale in West Virginia and in Appalachia country. And so we fought that. That fight culminated in 2024, and this will be relevant for the conversation, with the Manchin-Barrasso bill. So Senator Manchin, along with Senator Barrasso, a Republican from Wyoming. Wyoming is very much a fossil fuel state. Coal, oil, and gas. It's a petro state, really, at the end of the day, when you think about its politics and how the fossil fuel industry skews the politics at a state level. So that culminated in the Energy Permitting Reform Act. A challenge with that was that it was endorsed by a variety of Senate Democrats, including my senator, Senator Martin Heinrich, who is typically a champion of the climate and the environment. The pretext for supporting that bill was that modeling of energy systems determined that it would create a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And because it created a net reduction in GHG emissions, certain Democratic senators supported it. Now, I want to focus on that element, that metric of net GHG reductions, because we anticipate that that will be the metric used to justify a new permitting reform bill that comes out sometime later this year. We're anticipating in August. The reason we don't like that, and we are very much a climate organization, I have personally fought and won against coal-fired power plants, helping to retire coal-fired power plants in New Mexico. We have also fought oil and gas development across the Western United States. Our litigation resulted in taking roughly 10 million acres of federal public lands off the chopping block for oil and gas leases. These are public lands that are stewarded by the federal government in trust for all of us, the American people, for all people who live in this country. And so we're very much climate advocates. But the notion that you would reduce down a very complicated issue to a basic, does it increase or decrease emissions, was extraordinarily reductionist to us because it swept aside ecological dimensions. It swept aside, for example, public lands protection, wildlife protection. Was the energy development that would be accelerated under that bill, would that harm ecological systems? Would it cause disproportionate impacts to environmental justice communities, in particular communities, say, for example, in my neck of the woods in Northwest New Mexico, where you have Diné and Pueblo populations that have lived since time immemorial, who have suffered from a legacy of uranium development, coal-fired power combustion, coal mining, oil and gas. There's 40,000 oil and gas wells in Northwest New Mexico in an area called Greater Chaco. Those are dimensions of the discourse and of policy making that need to be accounted for. So I want to really accentuate that point as you think about what is going on right now with permitting reform. Nonetheless, we were able to defeat the Energy Permitting Reform Act at the end of 2024. Fast forward, of course, President Trump started his second term on January 20th, 2025. And this context is very critical, and it helps understand why permitting reform is particularly fraught in this moment. The administration initiated a staggering assault against bedrock environmental and community protections. Virtually every single domain that is out there, from public lands protection, Endangered Species Act protection, river and water protection, human health protection, air quality protection, all of those regulatory systems that have been built up over decades, those are now eroding. And in fact, the way that we're thinking about this moment is that we are at work in the ruins. At Work in the Ruins is a book by an author called Dugald Hine. He lives in, where is he now? I think he's in Ireland, but he may be in England. I can't remember exactly, but somewhere on those islands. And so this notion about work in the ruins and how we deal with this particular moment also informs how we think about what comes next after this permitting reform fight. Um, but as the executive branch was rescinding through this deregulatory approach all these bedrock protections, the Supreme Court was also acting. And so the Supreme Court is dominated with a 6-3 Republican majority. In fact, those Republicans, many of them are far-right ideologues. I don't think I'm saying anything that's particularly shocking here on this front. And through a series of decisions over the last several years, they have cut away at bedrock legal principles to guard the environment, to take climate action. People may have read there was a New York Times expose about the 5 days that shaped the Supreme Court and its shadow docket, which was based on the Clean Power Plan. So they essentially corrupted and fabricated various legal doctrines in the context of trying to knock back EPA's authority to address the climate crisis. And now we see how that has been weaponized time and time again against various protections, whether civil rights or the environment or in other domains. Meanwhile, so you have the executive branch with its deregulatory agenda. You have a far-right Supreme Court boxing in what we're able to achieve with the law. And then you also have Congress, dominated by Republicans. And Congress immediately took up the banner of permitting reform last year. Now, there are multiple bills on this front that are in Congress right now. A key one is the SPEED Act. And the SPEED Act is a bill that was written and sponsored by Representative Bruce Westerman. He is the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, a Republican from Arkansas. And then also Representative Jared Golden from Maine, a Democrat, but a very centrist Democrat, leans right. As a Democrat on the right side of center, even as he is a Democrat. So the SPEED Act moved through the House. Took several months for it to do so, and the SPEED Act ultimately passed in the U.S. House of Representatives in December 2025. It is now pending at the United States Senate. It is very unlikely, based on our understanding of the dynamics on the Hill, that the SPEED Act will in fact be taken up by the Senate. Nonetheless, the concepts that are in the SPEED Act are very much in play. And our expectation is that those concepts, which I'll get into in a minute, will be integrated into some kind of permitting reform bill that the Senate cobbles together and puts out to the public and starts to work through the voting process for. Now, what are those key concepts? And it's a very complicated bill. Has effects across different issue areas. I'll reduce it down to 4. The first is they want to scale back the applicability and scope of the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. So NEPA is often characterized as the Magna Carta of environmental laws. It is the bedrock of the bedrock, so to speak. NEPA requires a couple basic things. One, go talk to people before you take an action. Public participation. Second, take a hard look at the impacts of proposed federal action. Third, consider alternatives. Is there a better way to do this that has less of an impact on the environment and for ideally mitigate impacts? So that if you identify what those impacts are, do something about it. Now, the problem is that the Supreme Court, in its infinite wisdom, has said that NEPA is purely procedural, and proponents of whittling away at NEPA have latched onto this. But it kind of misunderstands what that role of NEPA is, which is to do air traffic control, to try to look hard at proposed decisions and to make the most reasoned and informed decision that you can make. This is the tool, and I mentioned before that we had knocked back 10 million acres of public lands, oil and gas leases. We did that on the basis of NEPA. And that is why it is in the target hairs, because the fossil fuel industry does not like it because we've used it very, very effectively. Now, to be fair, NEPA does apply to all federal action. So it would apply to, for example, a renewables project that has a federal nexus. For example, it crosses public lands. Nonetheless, it is primarily a tool to fight back against fossil fuels, not to obstruct renewables. So what the SPEED Act would do is to scale back and weaken NEPA's scope. And it would do that, for example, by saying you don't have to look at cumulative impacts. Cumulative impacts is a term of art. It basically means that, for example, if you're going to drill an oil and gas well in Greater Chaco, the area I mentioned in northwest New Mexico, where Dene and Pueblo people live since time immemorial, and that particular well is going to emit pollution into the air that causes human health impacts to, say, a school, which is literally a thing. There's an oil and gas well a quarter mile from a now closed school in that area. Then you also have to look at what are the cumulative emissions from all the oil and gas wells in the area. So in that school where you're going to drill a well a quarter of a mile away, what if there are 24 other wells all emitting pollution? Basically, what a cumulative impacts analysis requires is that you add up all those emissions to determine what are the impacts on the kids and the teachers that go to that particular school. So they want to scale that back. They want to say, no, just focus in on that one well, do piecemeal analysis. Why? Because it obscures the true impact of a particular project and the cumulative weight on a particular community or landscape. So that's one thing that the Speed Act would do. Second thing it would do is it would grant permission to federal agencies to ignore scientific and technical information. This sounds astounding. Maybe not so astounding under the Trump administration, right? But it would say that if that oil and gas company submitted a application to get a permit, at the point that permit is submitted, no more science or technical information can be gathered or assessed. It's as if you just freeze time. And so if that community decided to go out and hire doctors or other medical professionals to do an analysis of the air quality impacts of all that oil and gas development to the kids in that school, the agency would be precluded from giving that consideration, which to me is just wild, just wild. Just, I have expletives in my mind right now. I will not speak them. So that's the second thing that it would do. The third thing that it would do is that it would cut away at accountability and judicial review. And so if that community decided this is bad, this is going to hurt our kids, and we think it violates the law, we want to take the federal government to court. The court, under the Speed Act, would be prohibited from exercising its authority to prevent irreparable harm to those kids. The only recourse the court could take is what's called, if any lawyers are on here, they would be able to issue a declaratory judgment that the agency violated the law. Would it be able to vacate? In other words, to get rid of that drilling permit? No, not under the Speed Act. Would it be able to impose an injunction to protect against the risk of irreparable harm? Not under the Speed Act. So that is a major, major flaw. The last thing it would do, fourth point, is that it would create certainty for those permits. And what certainty means, and this is a term you will likely hear from politicians, is that once a permit is issued, the agency is unable to revoke it, except in very, very narrow circumstances. So if it creates an incentive during the Trump administration to rush through, issue and approve thousands and thousands of permits. He's already approved, I think it's 6,000 to 8,000 oil and gas drilling permits in the West. A new administration would be unable to revoke those, even if they violated the law, even if a new Department of Justice or a new Department of the Interior determined that those permits or leases violated the law, the administration would be prohibited from rescinding those permits. So the Speed Act is very, 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 very bad. And those concepts remain in play, including in the Senate. Now, as we think about the permitting reform fight and kind of stepping back from the Speed Act, but thinking about how to critique it, and also in light of, I love the fact that this is an action-oriented group and is going to write comments. Some of the critiques we have of the permitting reform fight, because I think the Speed Act is it's exemplary of what the concepts in play are in the Senate. Like the entire nature of the conversation in the United States Congress right now is rigged against ecology and against communities, against climate action. It is almost entirely about placating and ceding to I feel like weird even saying this, but oligarchical interests. So think energy and technology companies, energy industries, fossil fuels, but also renewable companies. And we like renewables. We want to deploy renewables. We want to build out as much green infrastructure as we possibly can. But that doesn't mean ceding political and legal control over to those corporations. And it certainly doesn't mean, from our perspective, ceding control over to technology companies who are now building out AI data centers like a plague. So that's a fundamental problem. The second problem is it's just a fundamental misdiagnosis of the problem. The criticism of the National Environmental Policy Act is predicated on a series of myths. It takes too long. It allows NIMBYs to stop bad projects. When you look at the literature, when you talk to experts, and I practice law in this specific domain for 27 years now, NEPA isn't the problem. The problem is that Congress has not afforded agencies sufficient capacity to be able to move those decision-making processes along to fruition, to accelerate them. Agencies lack technical and scientific capacity to be able to go through these permitting processes expeditiously. And then industry itself then gums up the works. So the lack of capacity at the agency level, and then also industry itself creating delays of its own. That is actually the principal problem when you look at the literature. If you want that literature, I'm happy to provide it. The last main problem with the whole issue of permitting reform is that it is premised on what is called all of the above approach to energy policy. All of the above. So that means not just renewables, not just nuclear, but also fossil fuels. Now, during the Biden administration, we had criticisms of all of the above because our notion is you're not going to turn the spigot off of fossil fuels immediately. But you do have to have a managed transition where you're phasing out fossil fuels as you're building out green infrastructure, renewables, battery storage, transmission, et cetera. That's going to take time. That's going to take decades. But you actually have to have a transition. You can't have just all of the above, which is essentially Congress punting its responsibility to determine the mission and directionality of U.S. energy policy. You're turning the keys to the kingdom over to energy and technology corporations. Let the market decide. The market is very much what got us into this problem in the first place. So we think that is a fundamental misdiagnosis of not just the problem, but then the solution, which is to cede control to those corporations. Now, what is the path forward here? And this is an area that I would emphasize, that I would encourage folks to really talk about, like less the problems and more what the solution is, because I think this Congress is very much looking for a solution. And one of the challenges that we have had is that, oh, you were always just against things. Well, we're against really bad things, and you're not talking about anything good at this point. So, we are working as actively as we can to try to change the narrative in Congress. And here's some of the components that we're trying to change the narrative. Now, first, front-end community engagement. Excellent literature. MIT did a great study a couple of years ago about how front-end public participation, if you include people, you create a sense of belonging with people, you listen to people, then they will buy into agency decisions and be less inclined to challenge it. They might even be ignored, but they want to be heard. People want to be heard. And so that front-end public engagement is essential, but it needs to be matched by back-end accountability. And that means judicial review. That means if a community gets railroaded or bulldozed over by a corporation and the federal government, for example, the Trump administration, they should be able to go to court. And not only should they be able to go to court, a court should be empowered to prevent irreparable harm. So front-end community engagement, back-end accountability, peanut butter and jelly. Think of it like that. Next, invest in agency capacity, fund agencies, fund scientific experts, fund the people who know how to move the paper forward, get to a decision, yes or no, one way or another. That's going to be essential, especially because of what the Trump administration has done to eviscerate agency capacity. Think DOGE. Third, and this is counterintuitive given the debate, but it's how we want to try to flip the script on this, strengthen, do not weaken NEPA. NEPA is that bedrock of the bedrock of environmental laws. If you implement it right with good agency capacity, then it can do air traffic control for all these permits. That's one of the problems. And this is fair that companies who want to do a project have to get, they got to get an air permit and a water permit. They got to get a NEPA approval. They got to get a groundwater permit. They got to get a right of way for a transmission line. Use NEPA to do the air traffic control, consolidate and streamline decision-making into the NEPA process. The next component of strengthening NEPA, give it some muscle. Create a basic mandate that agencies actively have to avoid and minimize harm to people and the environment. If the criticism of NEPA is that it's just paperwork, well, give it a purpose to actually actively, substantively avoid and minimize harm. Now, this one is particularly key. And if there's one thing that folks could emphasize in their letters, account for ecological and community values. Do not take a reductionist approach that just looks at, are the emissions net positive or net negative? If it's net negative, I'll support the bill. I think that's ridiculous. Sure. Is it a metric to keep in mind, to factor in? Absolutely. But the other factors are Are you actually accounting for and protecting ecological and community values? When we think about the climate crisis, it is not simply a function of energy systems. It is not simply a function of emissions. It is a function of how we prepare ourselves for this crisis as we live through this crisis. We're not just dealing with a climate crisis, but a biodiversity crisis. Some basic facts on this. 34% of plants in the United States are at the brink of extinction, 40% of animal species. 41% of United States ecosystems are at the brink of range-wide collapse. If those systems collapse, I don't care how much green energy we're able to build, we're screwed. So we got to account for those particular values. And then lastly, reject all of the above. We need a transition from fossil fuels to renewables. So that's what I would advocate for folks to argue to Congress. Now, let me talk a little bit about the politics quickly, and then I'll wrap up for
Yeah,
questions.
there you go.
Yes. We know we're not going to get a good bill in this Congress. So our intent is to survive in the 119th Congress until after the midterm elections, when we get a better Congress. Even then, because Trump will remain in the White House, we don't expect to be able to move a good bill. But we do expect, under the premise that the House flips at least, maybe the Senate, that we'll be able to start changing the narrative and introducing good bills, and we're really setting the stage for 2029 and a new presidency, or whenever Trump is out of office. That is a long time. And so we are taking this approach of the energy transition and the climate crisis is something that is not going to be solved in a year. It's not going to be solved in 2 years. It's not going to be solved in one term. It's a generational fight for all of us. I have 2 kids. They talk to me. Of course, they talk to me about climate change and their worries about the future because they hear their father rambling on all the time about this, yelling at, the NPR or the radio or reading an article I write. So strategic patience is an imperative here, and how we don't speed things up, but to build momentum for the long haul. So that is how we are approaching this moment. We expect a draft in the Senate of a permitting reform bill in August. And then we expect a bill to actually be taken up, moved through committee with a vote likely on it, assuming things play out as a lot of this bipartisan group of senators want to do after the midterm election. So in the lame duck is when the highest risk of a permitting reform bill getting passed. That is our expectation at this juncture. Final thing I'll say is, and I'll share this afterwards with Debbie. We just submitted a letter to Congress on behalf of 73 climate, religious, environmental justice, indigenous-led organizations, primarily in the Western United States, representing around 2.6 million people opposing permitting reform. So I'm happy to share that letter as well. We think this is an existential fight. And this fight, even though it's encapsulated in this current political dynamic, like we are at a fulcrum point. And so what we do in terms of setting the directionality for the generation ahead, that is going to prove essential. Permitting reform takes us very much in the wrong direction. So that was very long-winded. A lot of information there. Happy to answer questions.
We really appreciate all of this information. It is a complicated topic and a very political topic, and very much in the main thrust of the administration right now. I'm going to be a little bit of a thorn in your side, because there are those who say the need for permitting reform for renewables so that we can have nationwide transmission of solar and wind power is a desperate situation. Is there any way of addressing that within the opposition to the SPEED Act as it is now?
Yeah, we were actually talking about this earlier in the day. So there are several Democratic senators who have put out discussion drafts of bills involving transmission. The basic idea right now, the political play, is to try to get that merged into whatever permitting reform bill is put out on put out by the Senate. That's what we expect. And so the trade-off, though, for those transmission provisions would be a tax on NEPA. So gutting NEPA and then also various fossil fuel concessions built into that. So whittling away at environmental laws in exchange for those transmission provisions. We don't think that's necessary. Well, we think that's a deal with the devil. And it's a deal with the devil for a variety of reasons. One, there's nothing stopping the Trump administration from grinding a halt to renewables development and also transmission development to put those renewables on the grid. Now, the courts have stopped the administration thus far. For example, offshore wind leases off the coast of the Atlantic. Also today, knocked back a bunch of the Department of the Interior's anti-renewables blockade policies. Nonetheless, they have considerable discretion to grind a halt to that as well. So we think that if you get those transmission provisions, they really wouldn't have much of an effect until the Trump administration is gone. We were also advocating that they just take up the transmission provisions independently as a standalone bill. That is the proper course. So strategic patience coupled with standalone transmission bill.
So Steve Sondheim has an interesting question. He kind of challenges how could the bill as it stands really reduce emissions if it's so positive for carbon energy generation? It doesn't make sense. So maybe you can answer that
Right.
question a little bit.
Yeah, so the model itself was problematic. It was a cobbled together analysis of a bunch of different analyses done on the fly. So the bill was put out, a bunch of people did quick analyses of specific provisions in EPRA, and then they were cobbled together to reach this conclusion that it would result in a net reduction in emissions. I actually wrote about this, and I'm happy to share this as well, why those models were problematic in and of themselves. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that the models were right and it would have resulted in a net reduction of emissions. This goes to why a reductionist metric is dangerous, because yes, perhaps, and let's stipulate that it would allow more renewables and thus a reduction ultimately of emissions on a net positive basis. It would nonetheless lock in a lot of new emissions from carbon producing facilities. And the issue isn't so much that we need to reduce emissions, rather, we need to reach a target in terms of the reduction of emissions. So if you're just reducing a little bit, but then locking it in for the long term, then you're also locking in the warming, even at a lower level, that would cause. And so we thought that was deeply problematic. At a deeper level, the issue of allowing an acceleration of fossil fuel projects would harm the places and communities that we deeply care about. So it would, in my state of New Mexico, it would have opened up Greater Chaco to further oil and gas development. It would have opened up the Permian Basin to more and intensified oil and gas development and all the attendant harms, habitat fragmentation of public lands, erosion of watersheds and water quality impacts, human health harms to overburden communities that were already suffering from a variety of ailments, asthma, cancer, heart issues. So that was a very, very big problem. And we made a determination to side with environmental justice interests on that rather than this reductionist, is it a positive or a net negative of emissions? So even stipulating that emissions would be negative, we thought that the other harms, the ecological and community harms, outweighed that. And they were never addressed or contemplated by Congress. They just looked at that one reductionist metric.
We really, really appreciate it. I see more questions in the chat, but we do want to take action tonight before the hour gets late. So I see that Debbie, from the former employee of the EPA, is answering some of the questions. Erik, if you don't mind taking a look in the chat and answering some of the questions while we go on and allow Judy to get us prepared for our action for this evening. Thank you
Absolutely.
again, Erik. We really, really appreciate it.
I'll
All
stay
right,
on and
Judy.
answer questions as they pop up.
Great. Judy, we're on to you. We'll let you unmute and lead us in action.
Okay. Well, good to see you all. And here we go. We're going to put up the slides, Amy. We're going to usually we're writing to support a bill, but so this is a little bit of a different picture where we're going to be writing to our senators asking them to oppose the bill. And I'm just waiting. I'm not seeing it yet, but is everyone
We see
else?
it.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure why I don't see it. I have some strange things frozen. Maybe, can you see me okay? Because
We see you, and we see the Oppose the Speed Act first slide.
okay, perfect. Thank you. So as we learned tonight, the NEPA stands for National Environmental Policy Act, and it requires federal agencies to assess environmental impacts of projects. Sorry, so frustrating that it's not showing up on my end, but I can look at my own slides. And the goal, as we heard so eloquently described this evening, is to streamline NEPA, and in the end, that will benefit fossil fuel companies with very few benefits for renewable energy. Next slide. And as our speaker mentioned, the SPEED Act passed the House of Representatives in December and is now being discussed in the Senate. So what we are going to be doing is writing to our senators asking them to oppose the SPEED Act. So I saw mostly familiar faces. If you are new to this exercise, we'll be pulling up our senators' websites. Go to the last name of your senator, .senate.gov, go to contact, and we'll be sending them a message, or if you would prefer to call them, the phone number is listed here. And I put up here the two sponsors of the bill in case we have anyone from Arkansas or Maine in our group to know that you will be writing to the sponsors and asking them. So you can write to your other senator in that case. So going on to the last message, here's the full message from our action alert that we send out. And there's a place where you can put in your thoughts about how your Jewish faith calls you to respond to this. And also, if you have a personal story related to climate change, you can include that in the letter. But if you want to keep it simple and short, you can cut and paste whatever you want from this letter. And
it's now in the chat to make it easy for you to
wonderful.
copy it out if you'd like.
So pull up the website, write to both of your senators, tell them that you are opposing the SPEED Act. And if you have any questions, raise your hand or speak up. And we'll sit here and hold your hand through it. Thank you, everyone. And once you've completed, let us know in the chat so we can thank you and get a sense of where people stand.
So we're just going to hang out for a few minutes to give you a chance either to get on the phone or to send a message. And there are various versions in the chat that may be helpful to you as you write your message. Just keep putting it in again so that it remains on the bottom of the chat.
Thank you.
See a lot of eyes on the screens and fingers on the keys, so we'll give you another few minutes. All right, if you can't complete the action while we're on tonight, it is up on our website as our action alert for the month, and you'll find all the information there as well.
Carol, Kingsley, you have a question about your senators. What state are you in?
No, it was really to go back. I'm in California. It's really to go back to that slide, the previous slide you had where it showed the website on how to connect in, because I imagine that it's all kind of lockstep once you get there. I already did this. Our congregation did this as an action a few months ago, but I suppose it won't hurt to do a second one. That was probably more. It was addressing the members in Congress. So this is the Senate now.
So if you go to shift.senate.gov or padilla.senate.gov, as soon as you get to that website, there'll be a place where it says contact, and you can write to them that way.
Let's see, Sarah, do you have a question? I see your hand is up.
Yes, I do. Actually, a couple. First of all, I know I live in a state where I can count on, in Oregon, where I can count on both of my senators who are Democrats to act in a responsible fashion. So I wonder about the effectiveness and wonder how we can, can we send things?
I'll tell my favorite story once again. I lived in California for many years, 30 years. I became very close with Zoe Lofgren. She was a leading light on immigration. She calls me one day and says, "Rabbi, I need you to organize a protest on the lawn in front of my office." On what? On immigration? How can we protest? She says, "I have to go back to Congress to say that people are upset in my district." So even if your senator is supportive, you need to write so that they can say, "Hey, I'm getting all these messages from my people who care about this." I know sometimes if they're against, it feels like, what am I pushing against a stone wall? But it's important for them to hear from you if they're against, and it's important for them to hear from you if you're with them, that they know that there's support in the community. So thank you for doing that.
Okay.
If I may add too, very quickly, Senator Merkley is essential in this fight because he sits on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And so our political power mapping suggests that Merkley could be somebody who pushes back on Senator Whitehouse, who is the minority chair of Senate EPW. And Whitehouse is frankly a problem right now because he's the one who's fixating on just look at the emissions, get me a model, and I'll sign off on this. So we think Merkley is one to push back, especially on ensuring that ecological and community considerations are accounted for. So Merkley is important.
Okay, and I did want to ask you, I had put it in the chat, hasn't the idea of the SPEED Act already gone, started happening like in the decision in Minnesota?
Yeah, I answered you in the chat. So I think that are you referring to the boundary waters?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the boundary waters is a little bit of a different situation. So that's where the Senate used this Gingrich era law called the Congressional Review Act to strike down a mining withdrawal that was put in place to protect boundary waters. So that was congressional action. So it's akin to permitting reform, removing obstacles to development, but it was a little bit of a different mechanism than SPEED Act, and it was also not nationally applicable. It's targeted at boundary waters. I would note that the Trump administration is also using its executive level authorities, not legislative like Congress does, to revoke administratively imposed withdrawals. So in my area, there's the Upper Pecos watershed where a foreign company wants to resume mining, very similar to boundary waters. The Trump administration canceled a mineral withdrawal there. And then also around Chaco Culture National Historical Park, which is in the heart of that greater Chaco landscape that I was referring to, the administration is moving forward to revoke a Biden era by then Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland a mineral withdrawal. So these withdrawals are actually creating alarm that if you take all these withdrawals like boundary waters, Upper Pecos, Greater Chaco, and then you put in place the Speed Act, say you pass the Speed Act or some other iteration of permitting reform, then the administration would use all that new authority to accelerate all this fossil fuel and hard rock mining permitting on these public lands areas, and then lock in those permits. And that's where they would focus their attention, not on building out the grid and building out renewables. They have a lot of discretion. And even if they didn't have discretion, this administration has proven that it can't be trusted and does whatever it wants.
Yes,
So
we have certainly seen
that's kind of where we're at right now, is like, give them authority to speed up permitting. They're going to use that obviously for their favorite industries, which is AI, data centers, and fossil fuels, not renewables, even if it could theoretically benefit from renewables.
Thank you so much. I see that most everybody has finished writing. I see a few people still working. So if you're still working, please ignore me and keep going. But I'd like to give everybody a little bit of a homework assignment tonight as part of our blessing. I'd like you to look out your window tonight or go out on your porch and look at the moon. We often think of the blessing of the moon as the blessing we say in Shul on the Saturday before the new moon, the Rosh Chodesh. But there's also a blessing, Kiddush Levana. It's not really, you're not blessing the moon per se as a separate power, but it's a blessing related to seeing the new moon. And that can't be done on Rosh Chodesh because you can't really see the moon. It's always done a few days later. And I noticed as I was walking late last night that I could see just that sliver of the new moon. And I hope if you're not having too many clouds, you'll be able to see it where you are as well. And the blessing, in essence, thanks God for the dependable cycles of nature. And that's something that we're hoping to preserve, right? The dependable cycles of nature on our planet. It also reminds us that the Jewish people in some way are like the moon. There are times when things are bad and we sort of wane like the moon. And we hope that there will be times when things are good so that we can wax, we can grow into fullness like the moon. So Marcia Falk, who writes many blessings and prayers, has a blessing for when we see the moon, and that is asking for all kinds of blessings, blessings of goodness, of joy, creativity, and strength and serenity, of fulfilling work and dignity, satisfaction, success and sustenance, physical health and radiance. May truth and justice guide our actions and compassion temper our lives, that we may blossom as we age and become our sweetest and best selves. So I wish you a Chodesh Tov, a good month. Do go out and take a little peek at the moon tonight if you don't have too much rain and clouds where you are, and enjoy participating in that blessing of the sighting of the new moon. So thank you all for being with us. Thank you for writing or calling your senators. And thank you especially to our speakers, to Rabbi Gruber, who set a tone for our evening, and to Erik, who really informed us on a lot of the complexity here with the Speed Act and with all of these efforts at permitting reform and transmission reform. So thank you all very much. We'll see you next month. We have a very special program planned and hope that you'll be with us. Take care, everybody.